She walked into the grocery store the way most elders do, slow, quiet, invisible. The automatic doors sighed open, releasing a gust of chilled air that smelled faintly of bleach and freezer burn. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent to everything below them. Most shoppers saw only a woman with gray hair and a worn cane, the kind of person people unconsciously walk around instead of beside. What they didn't see was the woman who once broke enemy codes for a living, a mind that had intercepted wars before they began. Her name was Ms. Ruth Langston, 74 years old, retired and unassuming by design. Pricewell Grocery wasn't the kind of place where extraordinary things happened. It was where people debated coupons and compared cereal prices, where the most exciting event was when someone forgot to weigh their produce. Ruth came every Tuesday morning, early enough to avoid the lunchtime rush. She wore her crocheted hat pulled low, thick glasses that sometimes fogged from the cold aisles, and a light blue cardigan buttoned all the way to her throat. Her cane clicked rhythmically against the tile floor, steady, patient, stubborn. Down aisle 5, the sound of her cart's rattling wheels blended with the soft hum of the refrigerators. She reached for canned tomatoes, paused, and smiled faintly at how they were organized. Methodical rows, perfect order. It reminded her of the cipher grids she used to study, patterns that spoke in silence. The only thing that hinted at who she used to be was the thin gold necklace around her neck, mostly hidden under her sweater. The pendant looked ordinary, a simple golden circle, unless you stood close enough to read the engraving. But no one ever did. She was halfway down the aisle when the shouting started. Up near the self-checkout lanes, 2 young security guards were struggling to stop a teenage boy. He dropped something, then bolted for the door. The store manager yelled, "Stop him!" and chaos rippled outward. Heads turned. Phones lifted. Shoppers whispered. But Ruth, lost in her thoughts, kept walking at the same gentle pace, her cart creaking forward like a metronome. By cruel coincidence, her path intersected the chaos. The assistant manager pointed, flustered and panicked. "Grab her!" One of the guards, tall, flushed, no older than 25, spun and saw Ruth. To him, she looked like someone who might run. Maybe it was the oversized purse. Maybe it was the way she didn't look frightened. Whatever the reason, he acted before thinking. "Hey." He barked. Ruth turned, startled, eyebrows knitting behind her glasses. "Me?" He didn't answer. He strode toward her and grabbed her arm. Not harshly at first, but not kindly either. "What's in your bag?" "My purse," she said, confused. "Don't play dumb," he snapped, tightening his grip. His partner, breathing hard from the earlier chase, hurried over. The store went silent. Conversations froze. Even the beeping of the registers seemed to hesitate. Somewhere in the background, someone started recording. Ruth stood still, her back straight, her face calm but weary. There was no anger in her eyes, just a depth of disappointment that made the young guard uneasy. "I didn't take anything," she said quietly. Then, "You won't mind if we check," he replied. The assistant manager finally pushed through the crowd, panting. "Wait, that's not—" But the guard wasn't listening. He yanked her purse from her shoulder. The force made her cane clatter to the floor, and as she bent slightly to steady herself, the gold necklace slipped free from under her sweater. It caught the light. The guard didn't notice, but someone else did. A woman near the produce section gasped. "Officers," she called out, "you might want to look at her necklace." They ignored her. "She's wearing a VA Intelligence Commendation medallion," the woman said louder. Stepping forward, phone still recording, "She's someone." That made the second guard pause. He glanced down and froze. The pendant glimmered under the harsh store lighting, its engraved eagle spreading its wings across 13 stars. Beneath it, a line of words curved in fine lettering. Department of Veteran Affairs, Directorate for Intelligence Support, the kind of medallion you didn't buy. The kind you were given, quietly, formally, by people who didn't make mistakes. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Is that real? She worked for the government? Wait, what did she say her name was? The manager went pale. The young guard's grip loosened as if the metal had burned him. I'm sorry, ma'am," he stammered. This was just a misunderstanding." Ruth straightened slowly, her cane steady again. She looked him in the eye. "Oh," she said softly, "so now I'm ma'am." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His partner looked at the floor, jaw tight, shame creeping across his face. The woman filming lowered her phone slightly but kept it recording. She knew the world would need to see this. Ruth adjusted her cardigan, brushed off her sleeve, and took back her purse without another word. Around her, the air felt heavier, like the whole store was holding its breath. The manager tried to speak again, something about policy, procedure, confusion. But Ruth wasn't listening anymore. She was thinking about how easily suspicion had replaced respect, how quickly people decided who you were based on age, color, and silence. A nurse in scrubs stepped forward. "I saw what happened," she said gently. "They grabbed you without cause." Ruth nodded once. "They didn't ask, they assumed." Another shopper added, "They can't get away with that. Not after seeing that necklace." Ruth gave him a small, tired smile. "They've gotten away with worse." Outside, the crowd followed her into the parking lot, phones still rolling, whispers still rising. Within minutes, the video hit a local community page. 30 seconds of humiliation. 2 seconds of truth. A necklace glinting like justice catching the light. That night, it would reach thousands. And by morning, hundreds of thousands. Captions would read, "She served her country. It didn't serve her back. Her silence was more powerful than their badge." By the time anyone looked closer at the woman they'd wronged, it was already too late. By the time the video reached 200,000 views, Ruth Langston's face had become a mirror for something far larger than a misunderstanding at a grocery store. People reposted the clip with captions like, "She served her country. It didn't serve her back." Veterans groups began tagging her photo with "Honor Ruth" and "Bark Silent Strength." Civil rights pages called her the woman whose silence roared louder than outrage. Ruth didn't have social media. Her niece Nia was the one who told her. "Auntie, you're trending," she said, phone in hand, eyes wide. Ruth only smiled faintly. For buying eggs? But across the country, her story was already stirring something dormant. Conversations about age, bias, and quiet dignity. By sunrise the next morning, there was a knock on her front door. Standing on the porch was a tall woman in a navy blue blazer, her insignia glinting in the morning light. "Ms. Langston?" she asked softly. "I'm Captain Teresa McConnell, Department of Veteran Affairs. May I come in?" Ruth nodded and led her to the small living room, where sunlight filtered through lace curtains. The captain set a manila folder on the table between them. "I served under someone who used to talk about you," McConnell said. "He called you the Ghost Cipher. He said you cracked codes no one else could." Ruth blinked slowly. "That was a long time ago. Still matters today," McConnell replied, opening the folder. Inside was a formal letter, embossed with the VA seal. "The Secretary of Veterans Affairs asked me to deliver this personally. We saw the video. We're issuing an official apology and a public statement honoring your service." Ruth didn't reach for the folder. She simply stared at it for a moment, then said, "I don't want a parade, Captain. I want people to stop dragging us through the dirt before they find out who we are." McConnell nodded. "Understood. And even if I weren't who I am," Ruth continued quietly, "even if I were just a woman buying groceries, I'd still deserve respect. That's the part we're working on." "Ma'am?" When the captain left, Ruth sat by the window with her tea. Outside, the neighborhood carried on. Dogs barking, sprinklers clicking, mail trucks humming down the street. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. The sunlight caught her necklace, and she let it shine. Before the cane, before the arthritis, before the quiet mornings of retirement, there had been Agent R.M. Langston, cryptologic analyst, Defense Intelligence Agency, recruited in 1976 right out of Howard University. They'd found her in a linguistics seminar, taking apart a Russian cipher with nothing but a pencil and a stubborn sense of logic. Back then, the world was a chessboard, and Ruth had learned to see patterns long before others noticed they existed. Her training took her through a maze of languages, encryption methods, and long nights in windowless rooms filled with humming machines. She learned how to find meaning in static, rhythm in noise, truth in distortion. Ruth wasn't flashy. She never raised her voice or demanded credit. But when others hit dead ends, she simply kept working, methodical, relentless, precise. In 1981, she intercepted a scrambled transmission that changed everything. The message hinted at a chemical weapon transfer in North Africa. The data was incomplete, fragmented. She stayed overnight for 3 days straight, decoding patterns until the story unfolded. A route, a time, a handoff. Her report stopped the transfer before the weapons ever left the ground. There was no ceremony, no medal, no newspaper headline. Just a brief memo stamped "Acknowledged," and a handshake from a director who never quite met her eyes. For 17 years, Ruth served in silence. She translated intercepted audio logs, decrypted threats sent through back channels, and built the kind of intelligence webs that kept others alive. But in meetings, her voice was often ignored, until a man repeated the same idea and got credit for it. She didn't fight it. She just filed the solution, signed her initials, and moved on. Because in her world, noise didn't mean power. Proof did. She retired quietly in 1993 after a final classified mission in Eastern Europe. No farewell party, no interview, just a stack of debrief papers and a small envelope handed to her as she left headquarters. Inside was the same gold medallion that would one day fall from her sweater in aisle 5. She returned to her hometown in Illinois and bought a modest one-story house. She spent mornings tutoring kids in math, afternoons volunteering at the Veterans Center, and evenings sitting by the window with jazz playing low. The necklace stayed tucked away in her dresser drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that somewhere in a locked file, her name was written beside the words "classified success." The irony wasn't lost on her when, decades later, 2 young officers grabbed her arm and demanded to know what she was hiding. She'd spent her life hiding everything, her missions, her achievements, her identity. And now her truth had been exposed not by pride but by humiliation. When Nia came over that night, she found her aunt watching the news. Every channel was running the video. "This is crazy," Nia said, flipping through her phone. "Everyone's talking about you. Veterans are calling you a legend." Ruth smiled faintly. "No, baby. Just makes me tired." "Well, tired or not, the internet thinks you're Queen Ruth now," Nia said with a laugh. "Even soldiers are tagging you in tribute posts." Ruth looked out the window. "I just want people to stop acting like dignity has a dress code." The doorbell rang. A young journalist stood outside, microphone in hand, nervous but sincere. Ruth started to close the door, but the woman spoke quickly. "My grandmother served in the Women's Army Corps," she said. "She used to tell me black women had to serve twice and speak half as much." "I just wanted to say thank you." Ruth paused. "Then maybe you understand why I stayed quiet." "Are you still staying quiet?" the journalist asked softly. Ruth thought for a moment. "I don't have to speak," she said finally. "Not when the world's finally listening." By Wednesday morning, the video had crossed 1 million views. News anchors debated it like it was a national case study. One said, "That's what made it powerful. She never yelled." Another added, "It's the calm that unsettled people. She didn't cry, didn't shout. She just stood there, and that necklace said the rest." Meanwhile, inside a sterile conference room downtown, the 2 officers, Dalton and Reese, sat stiffly as the chief of internal affairs paced behind a thick folder. "Public relations is burning," the chief said coldly. "Do either of you understand what you just did?" Dalton shifted in his chair. She matched a vague description. "We were trying to be proactive." "Proactive?" the chief snapped. "She wasn't even near the theft. And you never verified anything before you laid a hand on her. You treated her like a suspect because she was elderly, black, and alone. And now she's a retired federal analyst with a commendation you couldn't spell." The silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand. Across the city, Ruth sipped her tea, watching a panel discuss her dignity as if it were breaking news. Nia sat beside her, scrolling through comments. "Auntie, look. Someone wrote, 'She's all of our grandmothers.' The calmness, the poise. I hope I carry myself like that." Ruth turned down the volume. She didn't need to hear the analysis. She'd already lived the proof. By Friday, things escalated further. The Civilian Oversight Board launched an official inquiry. Complaints poured in, not from Ruth, but from the witnesses in the store. 3 filed written affidavits describing the aggression and tone. 2 had never met Ruth before, but they couldn't forget how her shoulders dipped when the officer yanked her bag. Even the grocery chain issued a public apology. The regional manager arrived at Ruth's doorstep with flowers and a gift basket. Ruth accepted both politely, then later gave the basket to her neighbor. She folded the apology letter, filed it in her drawer, and scribbled on the envelope, "Didn't need this, but I kept it anyway." That weekend, a local organization called Shield Our Seniors invited her to speak at their annual dinner. At first she declined. Then she changed her mind. She wouldn't talk about the incident. She'd talk about legacy, about the power of restraint, and how many medals black women wore in silence, not around their necks, but in their endurance, because maybe people wouldn't listen to anger. But they might finally listen to dignity, armed with history. By the time the weekend arrived, Ruth Langston's name had become a symbol, not of outrage, but of reflection. Her calm defiance had unsettled people in a way shouting never could. The video was no longer just a clip. It was a mirror. On talk shows, experts dissected it like evidence. "She never raised her voice," one anchor said. "That's what made it powerful." Another replied, "It's the dignity. She made silence look like resistance." Across the city, two men couldn't escape that silence. At the precinct, Officer Dalton sat in a chair that suddenly felt too small. The blinds were drawn, the air heavy. Beside him, Officer Reese tapped his knee, eyes fixed on the floor. The Chief of Internal Affairs, a square-shouldered man with a face carved from fatigue, stood over a thick folder. "Public relations is on fire," he said flatly. "Do either of you understand what you just did?" Dalton tried to sound confident. She matched the description. "We were trying to be proactive." "Proactive?" the chief barked. She wasn't even near the suspect. "You didn't verify anything. You treated a 74-year-old woman like a criminal because she was elderly, black, and alone." Reese opened his mouth, then shut it. Dalton's jaw tightened. The chief slammed the folder shut. "Now she's a retired federal analyst with a commendation you couldn't spell. Congratulations. You turned a grocery store into a national ethics lesson." No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to defend. Across town, Ruth sat on her couch with the television muted. The news was still looping her face. The moment she turned toward the officer, the glimpse of gold beneath her sweater, the crowd realizing who she was. Every replay made it look like an event. To Ruth, it had only felt like a moment that went on too long. Nia sat beside her, scrolling through messages. "They're planning a community meeting, Auntie," she said. "City Council wants you to come. Even the mayor's supposed to be there." Ruth didn't look away from the window. "Why?" "To talk about what happened, to start healing, I guess." Ruth smiled faintly. People love healing when it's public, but she went anyway. Not for spectacle, but because silence had done its part. Now it was time for words. The church gymnasium smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish. Folding chairs filled every inch of space. Retirees sat beside college students. City workers stood in the back, still in uniform. No one had come because of a flyer. They had come because they saw the video. At the front of the room, two empty chairs bore name tags, Officer Dalton and Officer Reese. The city required their attendance. Accountability, they called it. When the officers arrived, they looked nothing like the men from the video. Dalton's eyes were sunken, his badge removed pending review. Reese wore plain clothes and fidgeted with his sleeves. They sat silently, unable to avoid the stares. The mayor stepped to the podium. "We are gathered tonight," he began, "not to shame, but to listen. Not to speak for, but to hear from." He gestured toward Ruth. "Our next speaker needs no introduction, but she deserves one." Applause followed, not thunderous, but steady, the kind that carried respect, not excitement. Ruth rose slowly. Her cane clicked against the wooden floor with each step. She wore the same cardigan from that morning in the store. Her necklace hung plainly outside her blouse now. Not hidden, not flaunted, simply present. She reached the podium, rested her hand on it, and looked at the crowd. "I'm not here to go viral," she began. Her voice was soft, but the microphone caught every word. "I'm not here to relive that morning. I'm here because this happens every day to people who don't wear a necklace." The crowd hushed. "I was stopped," she continued, "because I fit a story someone made up in their head. I didn't have the right look, the right walk, the right age, the right color." Then she turned toward the two officers. Her expression wasn't angry. It was precise. "I don't want your apologies," she said. "I want your reflection, because I won't be in that store next week, but someone else will. And she might not have a medal, just her dignity. And that should be enough. From the back of the room, a man shouted, "Say that again, Ms. Ruth." But she didn't. She let the silence speak for her. It hung in the air, heavy and alive. Dalton rose to his feet, voice trembling. I didn't know who you were." Ruth's eyes softened, but her tone didn't. "That's the point," she said. "You shouldn't have needed to." Reese shifted in his seat, face flushed. The weight of those words was worse than any disciplinary review. A young girl in the second row whispered to her mother, "She's like a superhero." Someone else murmured, "No, baby. She's something better. She's real." When Ruth finished, she stepped back from the podium. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was long. People stood not to cheer but to honor. Afterward, a line formed to shake her hand. Some cried. Some thanked her. Pastor offered to dedicate Sunday's sermon to her courage, but she gently declined. "Don't lift me," she said. "Lift the one still invisible." As she prepared to leave, a city council member approached holding a plaque. It read, "For courage and community impact." Ruth looked at it for a moment, then turned to the woman standing behind her, the nurse who had filmed the incident. "She's the one who spoke up," Ruth said, handing the plaque to her. If she hadn't, none of this would have happened. The crowd clapped again, not because they were told to, because they understood. Dalton and Reese slipped quietly out the back door, away from the cameras. For once, they weren't escaping punishment. They were stepping into the kind of accountability that doesn't end with paperwork. Within days, the city council introduced a motion called the Community Dignity Policy. It promised de-escalation training for all officers, mandatory suspension for misconduct toward seniors, and respect protocols for unarmed civilian interactions. The mayor called it a step in the right direction. The media called it an overdue adjustment. Ruth called it a start. She didn't want her face on press releases. When the local news invited her for a sit-down interview, soft lighting and sentimental music, she declined. "I've said what needed saying," she told them. "Let the echo do the work." Instead, she asked to visit Lincoln High School's U.S. government class. No cameras, no speeches, just desks, teenagers, and truth. The students had expected a lecture. Ruth gave them a question. "What does respect look like?" she asked. "When nobody's watching?" Silence. A few heads tilted. A girl near the front raised her hand. "Good manners?" "Good start," Ruth said. "But respect isn't just manners. It's recognition. It's knowing the difference between what someone looks like and who they are." Then she unclasped her necklace and set it on the desk in front of her. "This," she said, "got me listened to. But I earned it long before they saw it." The room stayed quiet. But it wasn't confusion. It was comprehension. Back at City Hall, Dalton sat through another hearing, this time with the department's ethics board. He didn't speak much. There wasn't a defense left to offer. In front of him were 4 new community complaints, 3 from people who'd stayed silent before Ruth's story broke. One was a woman followed in a store for looking nervous. One, a grandfather questioned for matching a vague description. And one, a teenager stopped for walking home with his hood up. All of them had been dismissed before. Now every one of them was being reviewed. Dalton didn't argue. He just listened. Reese, for his part, filed a request to transfer to administrative duty. His letter didn't say "I'm sorry." It said, "I need to understand the harm I caused." No excuses. No if I offended. Just truth. The department approved it. For the first time in years, someone had stepped away from authority on purpose. At home, Ruth folded laundry as Nia walked in, grinning with her phone. "A poet from D.C. wrote about you," she said. "It's called She Wore a Cane, a Cardigan, and a Warning." Ruth chuckled softly. "Clever title. You inspired people, Auntie." "I didn't mean to." "Still did." Ruth set a folded shirt aside and looked at her necklace lying next to her teacup. "I just wanted eggs." Nia smiled, shaking her head. "You got a movement instead." Meanwhile, Pricewell Grocery was trying to keep up with its own reckoning. The regional manager called an emergency staff meeting. Employees were retrained on profiling prevention, empathy and customer interaction, and community accountability. At the end of the session, a framed photo of Ruth was quietly placed on the break room wall. No gold frame, no headline, just a simple black and white print and 3 words typed underneath. Respect always first. That night, Ruth stood by her window again, watching the street lamps flicker to life. The world outside looked unchanged. Cars passing, porch lights glowing, children laughing in the distance. Yet something had shifted, subtle but irreversible. The silence she had carried for decades, the one that once felt like invisibility, had turned into something else. Something earned. In that stillness, she realized she'd never needed to raise her voice. All she'd ever needed was the truth, and the courage to stand still long enough for others to finally hear it. When the applause faded and the community meeting ended, Ruth Langston left through the side door into the night air. It was cool and clean after the heat of so many eyes. Her cane clicked on the concrete as she walked toward Nia's car, the rhythm steady and sure. She hadn't come to start anything, but something had started all the same. Inside the gym, the words she'd spoken still hung in the air. You shouldn't have needed to know who I was. People repeated it to each other in hushed tones as they folded chairs and gathered their coats. Not like a quote from a viral clip, but like a verse from scripture. Short, sharp, unforgettable. Within a week, the ripples began to reach every corner of the city. The mayor's office pushed through new departmental reforms. Headlines called it the Langston Initiative. Officially, it was named the Community Dignity Policy, a package of measures meant to make officers see the person, not the profile. The language looked polished on paper. Mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. Automatic suspension for misconduct against seniors or unarmed civilians. Public accountability sessions led by community representatives. The mayor called it a step in the right direction. The media called it an overdue reckoning. Ruth simply called it a start. When local reporters asked her for an interview, she declined. I've said what needs saying, she told them. Let the echo do the work. Instead of appearing on talk shows or cutting ribbons, Ruth went somewhere no camera crew expected. Lincoln High School. To speak with a U.S. government class. The classroom smelled of pencil shavings and floor wax. Teenagers slouched at their desks whispering when she walked in. Most had seen the video. A few had even shared it. Ruth didn't introduce herself with titles. She didn't mention the DIA or the medallion or the viral fame. She just placed a brown envelope on the teacher's desk and looked around the room. What does respect look like? She asked. When nobody's watching. No one spoke. The hum of the overhead lights filled the pause. A girl with braids finally raised her hand, saying yes ma'am or no sir. Good start, Ruth said. But respect isn't just manners. It's recognition. It's knowing the difference between how someone looks and who they are. Then she opened the envelope and pulled out the gold necklace. The students leaned forward as the medallion glinted in the fluorescent light. This, she said, got me listened to. But I earned it long before anyone saw it, and long after I was still ignored, silence. This time it wasn't teenage apathy. It was understanding. You don't wait for the world to hand you value, she continued. You live like you already have it. Back at City Hall, Officer Dalton sat in a windowless hearing room. The fluorescent lights made everything look harsher. The walls, his reflection, his memory. He didn't speak much. There wasn't a defense that didn't sound like an excuse. On the table in front of him lay 4 new community complaints. None were filed by Ruth Langston. All were from people who had seen her. Story and realized their own voices mattered. 1. Woman wrote about being followed around a clothing store for looking nervous. A grandfather described being stopped because he matched a vague description. A teenager recounted being detained for walking home in a hoodie. Each story had once been dismissed. Now they were being investigated. Dalton read them silently. The chief didn't yell this time. He didn't have to. The weight of the words was punishment enough. Across the hall, Officer Reese handed in a typed letter. It wasn't long. It didn't say I'm sorry or I didn't mean to. It said, I need to understand the harm I caused. No excuses, no conditions. He requested transfer to administrative duty. The department approved it the same day. For the first time in years, someone had walked away from authority voluntarily. At home, Ruth folded laundry slowly, each crease neat and deliberate. The hum of the dryer blended with the faint sound of a jazz record spinning in the background. Nia burst in, phone in hand, her face glowing. "Auntie, you have to hear this," she said. "A poet from DC wrote about you. It's gone viral again." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Another video?" "No, a poem." Nia grinned. "It's called She Wore a Cane, a Cardigan, and a Warning." Ruth chuckled softly. "Clever. You've inspired people, Auntie." "I didn't mean to. Still did." Ruth smiled faintly and folded the last towel. "I just wanted eggs," Nia laughed. "And you got a movement instead." Meanwhile, Pricewell Grocery held a mandatory staff meeting. Employees sat in metal chairs under buzzing lights as corporate representatives lectured about preventing bias-based interactions. The new regional manager, nervous and sincere, promised things would change. "Profiling stops today," he said. "Every customer deserves dignity." At the end of the meeting, he unveiled a framed photograph for the break room wall. It was a still image of Ruth from the video. The moment her necklace caught the light, no gold trim, no fancy plaque. Just 3 words typed beneath her name. "Respect always first." The employees clapped quietly. A few wiped their eyes. Letters began arriving at Ruth's house soon after. At first a few, then dozens. She opened the first one on a rainy afternoon. It came in a plain white envelope with no return address. The handwriting was neat but hesitant. "Miss Langston, I was in the store that day. I was the woman by the freezer section holding my daughter's hand. I saw what happened. I saw them grab you and I froze. I didn't say a word. I should have. I went home and cried that night. Not just for you, but because I realized I've been silent too many times. Thank you for not raising your voice. Somehow your silence spoke louder than I ever have. I'm learning, I promise. A witness who's ready now." Ruth folded the letter carefully and placed it in her drawer. Not because it flattered her, but because it reminded her that even inaction leaves a mark, and awareness was its own beginning. A few days later came a second letter, typed neatly on grocery store stationery. The sender signed it Angela M. Reyes, cashier, Pricewell number 18. "Ms. Langston, I saw your face that day. I saw the look, not fear, but the kind of weariness only people who've been wrongly accused before recognize. I wanted to speak up, but I was new and scared to lose my job. I thought the manager must have had a reason. I was wrong. I'm sorry it took the internet to make me see how wrong. Since then, I've spoken up twice. Once for a young black man being followed by security, and once for an older Latina woman being questioned for wandering. This time, I didn't freeze. Because you reminded me that quiet doesn't mean small." Ruth read the letter twice. She smiled and tucked it beside the first one. Then she labeled a new folder in her drawer with a single word. Echoes. Sunday came warm and bright. At church, the Reverend called her name during the service, inviting her to stand and receive a Justice Peacemaker award. Ruth politely declined, but stayed afterward in the courtyard longer than usual. A teenage girl approached shyly, clutching a notebook. "Ms. Langston, I'm applying for ROTC," she said. "People keep telling me to pick something safer, but my mom showed me your video. She said, 'See this woman? She served and didn't need to brag, but the world still knew.'" Ruth smiled, eyes soft. "Service doesn't always need applause," she said, "but it always needs intent." The girl nodded, shoulders straightening. "Then I'll serve like that." Across the city, Officer Dalton sat in a mandatory sensitivity training session. The facilitator, a calm woman in her 40s, opened the workshop with a sentence that landed heavier than any punishment. "Bias isn't about hating someone. It's about assuming you know them before they speak." Dalton didn't argue. He didn't take notes. He just listened. In the quiet moments, Ruth's voice came back to him. "I don't want your apologies. I want your reflection." And for the first time, he understood what reflection really felt like. It wasn't guilt. It was seeing himself through someone else's silence, and not liking the view. That evening, Ruth stood at her kitchen window. The porch light hummed softly. From down the block came laughter from a backyard barbecue, the sound of life moving on. She let the stillness settle around her, not as loneliness, but as peace. On her kitchen table lay the folder marked Echoes, 2 letters, a poem clipping, and a printed email from the high school teacher who'd written, "You reminded my students that respect is a practice, not a reaction." She didn't frame the letters. She didn't need to. They were reminders that grace, once shown, tends to multiply quietly. In the end, the noise of the world had made her visible. But what came after? The reflection, the humility, the change. That was the real victory. The kind that doesn't trend but endures. 3 weeks after the incident, the world had started to move again. But Ruth Langston's story hadn't faded. It had simply changed shape. It wasn't just a viral clip anymore. It had become a conversation, a mirror, a question people were still struggling to answer. What does dignity look like when no one's filming? The city was quieter now. The grocery store had updated its policies, officers had been retrained, and Ruth had gone back to her ordinary routines. Tea in the morning, volunteering in the afternoons, the hum of jazz in the evenings. But something in her world had shifted. The silence she'd once worn like a shield no longer felt like invisibility. It felt earned. That afternoon, as golden light spilled across her porch, Ruth sat in her favorite wicker chair, polishing the pendant that had changed everything. The gold caught the sunlight and glowed against her wrinkled fingers. It wasn't large or ornate, just a small, circular medallion engraved with an eagle and 13 stars, the mark of the Department of Veterans Affairs, Directorate for Intelligence Support. Naya appeared at the screen door, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. "You ever gonna tell me what that thing really means?" she asked with a grin. Ruth didn't look up. "You already know what it means to them," she said. "But you want to know what it means to me?" Nia stepped out onto the porch and sat beside her. "Yeah, I do." Ruth took a long breath. "You ever done something important and been told not to speak of it?" Nia tilted her head. "Maybe. Now imagine giving your whole youth to that kind of work," Ruth said softly. "Traveling to countries you can't name. Decoding messages that aren't supposed to exist. Saving lives through silence. And never getting to tell a soul." Nia's eyes widened. "That was real?" Ruth nodded once. "Very real." She looked down the street, remembering. It was Berlin, 1989. She was 38, wearing a gray trench coat and a calm face that hid the pulse of fear beneath it. Her job wasn't glamorous. She worked in a cramped listening post filled with static, wires, and coffee that tasted like metal. But that night, the signal mattered. She intercepted a string of coded transmissions coming from an abandoned consulate safehouse. It took her 97 seconds to recognize the pattern. A diversion operation designed to stage a riot near the city center. The riot would draw media and military attention while a separate unit smuggled weapons through an airstrip under false refugee tags. 97 seconds. That was all it took for her to decode it, report it, and stop it before it began. No one ever knew her name. Her report was signed, Analyst Langston, Clearance Level 4. The next morning, her superior handed her a plain envelope containing a single medallion. No handshake. No press, no parade. Just quiet acknowledgement that somewhere, someone's children got to live because she refused to make noise. That was the day Ruth Langston learned that service didn't always come with applause, and that silence, when chosen, could be its own kind of strength. "You never told Mom about any of that?" Nia asked, breaking the quiet. Ruth smiled faintly. "Your mother thought I worked in communications." Nia blinked. "Didn't you?" "Technically," Ruth said, laughing softly, "just not the kind she imagined." They both laughed, the sound small but warm. Ruth looked down at the pendant again, her reflection curved in the gold. "I wear this," she said. "Not so people remember me, but so I do. On the days my knees ache, or when people look through me in stores, or when someone decides I must be less than what I am. This reminds me I was more than what they see." Naya's eyes shimmered. "I think people see it now?" "Maybe," Ruth said quietly. "But don't ever wait for the world to notice you before you know your worth." A few days later, an official letter arrived from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The envelope was embossed with gold lettering and sealed with a faint wax crest. Inside was an invitation. "The Secretary of Veterans Affairs cordially invites Ms. Ruth M. Langston to be recognized at the National Capitol during the annual Women in National Service ceremony." Ruth read it once, then again. Then she set it on the table beside her tea. Whether she went or not, it didn't matter. The truth no longer needed clearance. It lived in her voice, her walk, and her silence. all of which had already spoken louder than any podium could. The ceremony came 2 weeks later. The auditorium wasn't grand, just modest and softly lit. Rows of veterans, families, and staffers filled the seats. A banner hung across the stage. Women in national service honoring those who served quietly. Each name called was met with polite applause. One by one, women crossed the stage. Soldiers, nurses, code clerks, translators. Each with a story too big for the space allotted. Then the announcer paused before the final name. Ms. Ruth M. Langston, former Intelligence Operations Analyst, Defense Intelligence Agency. The room shifted. Not louder, just stiller. People leaned forward, recognizing the name from the headlines, the video, the necklace. Ruth rose slowly, cane in hand. She wasn't wearing a new outfit, just her usual cardigan, slacks, and the necklace resting outside her blouse this time. Her steps were measured, calm. When she reached the podium, she adjusted the microphone slightly. She didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't clear her throat. She just began to speak. I was told once, she said, that the most powerful weapon I could carry was discretion. Her voice filled the space, steady and low. But sometimes that weapon turns inward. It silences you until you start to believe your quiet means less. In the front row, Nia sat upright, eyes glistening. I didn't ask to become a symbol, Ruth continued. I just asked for eggs. A quiet laugh rippled through the room. Soft but knowing. What I got instead, she said, was a reminder that silence doesn't protect you when the world decides what you're worth based on what you look like. The audience listened without moving. Not one phone rang. Not one chair squeaked. I served my country without needing a stage, Ruth said. But I realized something. When dignity is attacked in public, the response must be public too. Because silence may keep the peace, but it never builds justice. She paused, letting the words breathe. So no, she added finally. I won't hand this necklace back to a museum. It was never meant to be a decoration. It's a reminder, to me and now to all of you, that we don't earn basic respect by revealing medals. We earn it by existing, and that should be enough. Ruth stepped back. There was no dramatic flourish, no mic drop, just stillness. Then came applause. Not explosive, but heavy, layered with emotion. When she stepped off the stage, a young congressional aide approached her. Ms. Langston, she said softly, your story changed how I see my own grandmother. Ruth smiled. Then maybe you'll start listening before assuming. The aide nodded. I already have. By the end of the week, Ruth's speech was posted online twice. Once by the event organizers. The second time by someone in the audience who captioned it, "You shouldn't have to be a war hero to be treated like a human being." It spread again. But this time, it wasn't outrage fueling it. It was recognition, comment sections filled with stories. She reminds me of my mom, who never got credit for anything she carried. Respect shouldn't depend on medals or titles. I showed this to my kids. We talked for an hour. The tone had changed. The world wasn't arguing. It was reflecting. At home that night, Ruth sat by her window, a cup of mint tea steaming beside her. Outside, the street was quiet, bathed in the glow of porch lights. On her table lay the medallion, the VA invitation, and a small stack of the letters she'd begun keeping in her folder labeled Echoes. The television played softly in the background. A panel of experts debated the next steps for police reform. Ruth reached for the remote and pressed mute. Sometimes silence wasn't surrender. It was choice, the act of deciding what deserved your energy. She looked around her small kitchen, the same table, the same worn curtains, the same sense of order she'd built over decades of choosing composure over chaos. For the first time in years, she felt completely at ease in her own stillness. She thought about the woman who had written her first letter, the one who had frozen by the freezer aisle, hand in her daughter's, and she thought of the young cashier, Angela, who now spoke up when others stayed quiet. The echoes had grown. They no longer belonged to her alone. The following week, Ruth took the bus to Pricewell Grocery for the first time since the incident. The sliding doors opened with their familiar mechanical sigh. The same scuffed tiles greeted her, but the air felt different. People saw her this time, not the kind of seeing that gawked or whispered. but the quiet acknowledgement of someone whose presence meant something. The store manager. Mr. Farley spotted her near the customer service desk. His shoulders stiffened and he hurried over. "Ms. Langston," he said, voice low. "I just wanted to say, we've made some changes." Ruth tilted her head. "I heard. Señor Care Protocol. Liaison outreach. Staff retraining. Yes, ma'am. We're trying. Trying's good," she said. "But I came for eggs, not speeches." He nodded, swallowing the rest of his words. As Ruth pushed her cart toward the dairy aisle, she noticed a new laminated sign nailed above the exit. "This store stands against profiling, discrimination, and the erasure of dignity, regardless of age, race, or status." She smiled to herself, small and proud. Two teenagers whispered as she passed. "Dude, that's the lady from the necklace story." Ruth chuckled under her breath, not because they recognized her, but because she recognized herself again. Not a symbol, not a target, just a woman who had outlasted injustice long enough to call it by name. At the register, a young cashier smiled warmly. "Good morning, ma'am." "Let me carry that for you." Ruth handed over her basket. "You know who I am?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then don't call me ma'am like I'm fragile." The girl grinned. "Yes, Miss Ruth, got it." Outside, as Ruth waited for her ride, a boy no older than 10 tugged on her sleeve. "Are you the one who didn't yell?" he asked. Ruth looked down at him. "I didn't need to." "My grandma said you reminded her of herself," the boy said. Ruth smiled. "Then your grandma must be made of something strong." "She said you're what grace looks like," he whispered. "Grace only works," Ruth said, "when people are finally watching." Just then, a city bus rolled by. On its side was a poster, a sketch of Ruth in profile, head high, cane in hand, necklace shining in the sun. The caption read, "Don't wait for medals to give people their worth." That night, Ruth sat at her kitchen table again, the medallion resting beside her tea. Outside, the cicadas hummed. She exhaled deeply and smiled, not because the world was fixed, but because it had started to listen. For years, she'd been silent because she had to be. Now, she was silent because she chose to be. And in that silence lived her greatest victory. Not fame, not forgiveness, but presence, the kind that lingers long after the noise fades, the kind that turns an ordinary woman buying eggs into a story the world won't forget, the kind that reminds us all that grace, quiet, deliberate, and unshaken, is sometimes the loudest sound in the room.